That's the sound of my newly rebuilt National Cowboy guitar from the 1950s. I mentioned a few episodes back sending this guitar off to Baxendale Guitar to be rebuilt, and I got it back, and it's just wonderful. As I expected, Scott Baxendale's conversion process brought the guitar back to life, and it now plays perfectly with a wonderful tone, as you can hear. I'd like to thank Scott Baxendale for doing his conversion process on this old Gene Autry guitar, and I'd like to thank Baxendale Guitar for sponsoring today's episode of the podcast. If you've got an old guitar sitting in the corner that you'd like to turn into a world-class instrument, look up Scott Baxendale at baxendaleguitar.com. I'd like to kick off today's show with a poem by the old-time poet Bruce Kiskadden. This is one entitled, Alone. The hills get awful quiet when you have to camp alone. It's mighty apt to set a feller thinking. You always halfway wakin' when a horseshoe hits a stone or you hear the sound of hobble chains a-clinkin'. It's then you know the ideas that you really have in mind. You think about the things you've done and said, and you sometimes change the records that you nearly always find in the back of almost every cowboy's head. It gives a man a sort of different feeling in his heart, and he sometimes gets a little touch of shame when he minds the times and places that he didn't act so smart, and he knows himself he played a sorry game. It kind of makes you see yourself through other people's eyes, and maybe so your pride gets quite a fall. When you're all alone and thinking, well, you come to realize you're a mighty common feller after all. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Hal Cannon. Hal is a songwriter, musician, radio producer, and folklorist. He was the founding director of the Western Folklife Center and was also one of the founders of the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada. Hal now plays music with the band Three Hat Trio. I should also mention that it's Hal Cannon playing the great banjo that you hear as the theme music right here on Cowboy Crossroads. Back in the spring, I sat down with Hal at his dining room table in his beautiful home in Virgin, Utah, to record this interview. Here's Hal Cannon.
I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, in an old Mormon family. My great-great-grandfather was Brigham Young, and my great-grandfather was the first territorial senator and from Utah, or from the territory of Utah. And so, you know, we go back a long ways in Salt Lake City and in Utah and in the West. But, you know, I don't know. When I was a kid, I didn't feel very connected to where my own roots. And, you know, I love my family. I come from a really loving family. But I was always sort of looking for something different, something maybe a more romantic life. And I remember when I went to my cousin's house and he played me this old LP of fiddlers playing music in a cabin. It was some old field recording, and I heard the people tapping their foot on the floor and playing these ancient fiddle tunes, and I just for some reason I had this vision that I wanted to be there, that I wanted to be in that place, and I wanted to be part of that. And I don't know why, really. I had a perfectly good circumstance around me, but so I really, at that point, when I was, 11, 12 years old, really keyed into folk music, and bluegrass and old-time music, and music particularly from the Mountain South. I just loved it. And my cousin, one cousin had brought Reverend Jesse Fuller to his high school when he was a high school senior. So he knew a little bit about folk music. And I had another cousin who played the guitar. I had another cousin who was a concert pianist. And I tried playing clarinet. I tried to be in a band, but in a brass band. But it just didn't do much for me. But then I started taking lessons on guitar and singing folk songs, and I just happened to take private lessons from Jim and Rosalie Sorrells at their home, and joined when I was about 12 years old something called the Intermountain Folk Music Society, and every month we'd get together at the University of Utah, and it would be Utah Phillips and Rosalie Sorrells and some other really good players, and basically we'd play music, and we'd start the evening by singing "This Land Is Your Land" together, and I think we'd end the evening with "Good Night, Irene." But I loved that. I thought it was great. And so by 8th grade, I was playing old-time music. I had a friend of mine and I sang Blue Sky Boys songs, and we both took lessons from Utah Phillips down at Southeast Music. And there was a thriving folk music scene in Salt Lake City. And I took advantage of it and loved it. It was so different than my family life. Rosalie Sorrells would bring in these artists like the New Lost City Ramblers, the Georgia Sea Island Singers, Hetty West, John Jacob Niles, all these folk musicians who were coming through, because Salt Lake's sort of on a crossroads. You sort of have to, you can't get to the West Coast without going through Salt Lake if you're driving or on a train or on a bus. And so we'd book these concerts, and so I got to not only hear these people in concert, but they'd have these wild parties afterwards, and they'd hire me to take care of Rosalie's wild 5 kids. But mostly I was just there with my eyes wide open, watching this scene that was so different than what I grew up with. I very quickly became interested in the voice of rural Americans making music. I loved people like Mance Lipscomb. I loved the country blues. I loved the people in the South who recorded on Starday Records, and I'd get their catalogs and just go through them, and I'd want all these records and of bluegrass by the people who really lived in the South and lived in the mountains. So I wasn't as interested sort of in the urban revival as I was in this country phenomena that was ongoing. I remember very vividly that Utah Phillips, Bruce Phillips, was a very much a political. He for him, folk music was so tied to a political movement, and he was an anarchist, and he would take us down to something called the. What was it called? It was a guy named Ammon Hennessy, the Joe Hill House. Maybe it was the Joe Hill House. Anyway, it was basically a refuge for hobos, and we go down to this place right on the railroad yards where the hobos were, and go into this house that was run by a man named Ammon Hennessy, who was also an anarchist, and we'd play songs and hang out there, and I don't know, but for a very sheltered Mormon boy, that was really an extreme thing to do. And I remember going down to these dark railroad yards in South Salt Lake City, and it would just seem so scary, and I'd be almost shivering with fear as we'd go down and get out in the dark, and I thought, we're going to get rolled any minute. But no, everyone was very friendly to us. Phillips knew all the hobos, and so we were in good stead because we were with the right company. Bruce Phillips was, a wonderful performer and a very compassionate guy. He particularly loved hobos. He had a real affinity for wobblies and for people who were involved in sort of the opposing politics. And I grew up in a very conservative family politically, so it was really an eye-opener for me to see that.
As mentioned previously, Hal was one of the founders of the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada, which began in January of 1985. Before the Elko Gathering, cowboy poetry was virtually unknown and unheard of to the general public. I asked Hal when he first became aware that cowboy poetry was a living tradition.
In the 70s, I remember the Deseret String Band did a few recitations, so I was aware that there were cowboy recitations, but I had no idea that real live cowboys and retired cowboys still recited poems, and that it was a living tradition. I guess that was the key. In the mid-late 70s, I got hired by the Smithsonian, but through a sort of a consortium of Nevada-based organizations to come and do field work in Nevada. And I'd never done field work in Nevada, and I was working to find people to come to a festival that was going to happen in Elko, Nevada, called the Pioneer Arts and Crafts Festival, I think. I can't remember the exact title of it. But so I was doing field work. This was sort of a cooperative effort on the federal level between the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian Folk Life Program, and the National Endowment for the Arts Folk Arts Program. The Library of Congress had just started the American Folk Life Center. So those three agencies were sort of trying to find ways they could work together. And so on the federal level, they sponsored it. And then there was several small institutions in Nevada that were the recipients of this federal contract, I guess. And so I got out, I think the first cowboy poetry I really heard from a retired cowboy was a guy named Eldon Walker in Wells, Nevada. I went to his house, and here was this gruff old guy, just tough as nails, and he said, "You want to hear some poems?" And I said, "What? Poetry?" And I said, I just thought to myself, this is the most unlikely guy in the world to recite poetry. And he sat down and he recited some poems for me, and I was transported. I just thought it was fantastic. And then a little later, when we ended up having the festival, a woman named Sarah Sweetwater had befriended Waddy Mitchell and I think Ross Knox and Larry Schutte, and they had come to this festival, and I met them for the first time at this Arts and Crafts Festival. And Waddy got up and recited some poetry, and I had brought Eldon Walker with me, and a fellow named Jack Walther got up and told some poems, and I was just sort of like blown away by this. And So I approached Waddy right then, and I said, I asked him some questions about his interest in this, and I said, "What do you think we could ever get, do more and get a bunch of cowboy poets together or reciters together?" And he looked at me like I was crazy, but we kept in touch, and he went on to perform at some storytelling festivals, and he started to expand his horizons. He wasn't just reciting poems to cowboys. And at the same time, I was made aware through another folklorist in Colorado about Baxter Black and how he was out there making a living, telling stories, reciting poems. And a fellow named Jim Griffith in Arizona worked with a fellow named Van Holyoke who recited poems. And so some of us who were folklorists, I was the state folk arts coordinator in Utah, we got together. In fact, we were at the Library of Congress in a meeting, and we went for a break, and we were just sitting around talking with several of the Western states folklorists, and said, we were saying, is there anything we could do as a region, do a regional project that sort of defies state lines? And Jim came up with the idea of maybe doing a research project based on cowboy poetry. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. And so we all took some time and started doing field work on our own. And then eventually we applied for some grants and tried to get money to make more of a concerted effort to go out to ranches and collect poetry. And we were collecting some songs while we were at it, but it was mostly around poetry and recitation. And finally we got enough money together to plan the first Elko Cowboy Poetry Gathering, which ended up first taking place in late January of 1985. We had I think we had thematic sessions, and I think we brought in a number of poets, and we sort of did it by state. So we'd have a Montana session and an Arizona session. So there'd be 4 or 5 people from Montana and 4 or 5 people from Arizona who recited poems. And then we did some thematic sessions. I remember one called Good Horses and Bad Rides. And these guys who they didn't know each other, they got up on stage, and each one of them told some poem about losing the best friend horse they'd ever had, and they're all almost in tears. But there was sort of a recognition that this was a bigger thing than just them or a few people they knew, that there were other people around the region who loved words, loved the poetic voice, and the people in the audience were sort of blown away at the same time because they recognized this too. It was pretty raw, there were a couple of people who were really pretty good performers, Baxter Black particularly, and Waddy, I guess. But the rest of them had never really been in front of an audience, and their knees were shaking, and it had a lot of nerve to it, I guess, to start out with. But it was quite exciting. I remember we had a banquet on Saturday night. That was going to be the Saturday night program, and we decided to have the keynote address on Saturday night just before dinner. And we held it upstairs at the Stockmans, and somehow we printed too many tickets, and the Stockmans were expecting about half the number of people that came. So there wasn't enough food, but they did have a well-supplied bar. And so everybody, before the food even got out, were drinking a lot. And so we decided to have the keynote address before dinner. And people had been at the bar with an empty stomach for the last hour or two. And it was a pretty noisy bunch. And Guy Logston was going to give the keynote address. So we introduced Guy, and he looked at the audience, and he did the smartest thing I've ever seen a performer do. He said, I've been charged to give the keynote address tonight, and I've never had a standing ovation, but if you give me a standing ovation, I won't give my talk. So everybody stood and cheered for Guy Logston, and he sat down and we continued drinking. It's hard to know when sort of the zeitgeist of a moment sort of takes over, but in retrospect, I mean, I guess we could say that it was intentional that we put this forum together and all these amazing people came together. But I don't think none of us knew that there was so much power and so many great voices that sort of needed that kind of a forum right then. And so we were just sort of lucky, I guess. We started something, and it could have been a abysmal failure if people weren't ready for it, but the audience was thirsty for something like this. There was certainly some incredible talent, people that came. And some of the people that were the most surprised, I think, were people like Glenn Orland, who had been playing at folk festivals and sort of had been on the folk scene, but he was sort of the only authentic cowboy that was ever featured at folk festivals for a long time. And it was just sort of like he was on the menu, he was the token cowboy singer that folk festivals would hire. And he helped us plan the first gathering. He was very involved in giving us advice. But I think he was, there was nobody more surprised at the power of this and the kind of people that came together than Glenn Orland. He was. We were all surprised by it, to tell you the truth, and gratified too. I mean, when Buck Ramsey sent his tape in that first year, and we brought him, and it was like he had. He talked about it. He talked about finding his tribe, having lost his tribe, and then finding them again through the Cowboy Poetry Gathering. And he was quite articulate about it. But he, I remember he came the second year, and he was so excited to come to Elko that he came a week early, and he came to my house, and I was remodeling a house in Salt Lake City, and I didn't know what to do with him. I said, Buck, it doesn't start for another week, and I said, but I'm sheetrocking my house. Can you come up and help me? So it was really laughable. I was up sanding sheetrock and perfect tape cement, and he was rolling around in his wheelchair with a vacuum cleaner, just sucking up all the dust. And we were talking a mile a minute about all these traditional recordings of cowboy songs, and we were listening to Carl Sprague full blast on my cassette machine, and just having a great time talking about cowboy songs and hanging out, and we became friends at that point. And I just feel a lot of gratitude that I just didn't know him through the Cowboy Poetry Gathering, but we remodeled a house together, basically. Got to know each other. And that was true of a lot of people. I mean, I don't know how many people went up to Ian Tyson's little writing cabin and wrote songs with him. And people got together, and then a lot of other events started, and people got to know each other at other events, and that whole aspect of reunion just got amplified over and over again.
Hal Cannon now spends most of his time making music with the band The Three Hat Trio. Hal sings in the band and plays guitar and banjo, and they make beautiful sounds that they call American desert music. I was curious to know if Hal's work as a folklorist and his background in traditional music had informed the music he is making today.
In my life as a folklorist and as a person who documented and made radio shows and put on festivals, I was always interested in the things that that really spoke authentically about people's lives and about the reality of where they lived and their occupational experiences. And that was always my favorite part of that, is sort of the honesty of it. And the more sort of stylistic it is, the more it sort of fits into, a set of, ground rules that I'm not that interested in that, I guess. The more it's sort of constricted by style and by peer pressure. I had a friend the other day who just talked about how much pressure she feels when she goes to a fiddle jam session, that she's just doing it right. And I don't like that. I think that artistry should be freeing rather than constricting. And so when I look at tradition, I look at the aspects of it that are all about being more free and free stylistically. I guess that, I've listened to so much traditional music from so many places, and I've been so influenced, I guess, by it that I can't help but make those kinds of sounds when I play my instruments or sing. But I find that we have people that come up to us after a Three Hat Trio concert, and they'll say, that sounded so Eastern European. Or I had a guy come up and said, that sounds like that's from India, or that sounds like it's from the Middle East. And so people hear all sorts of things in the music. And, I have to say that I think a lot of that is the influences of going to a lot of these places. I mean, you and I went to Turkmenistan, and, I think that music somehow got ground into my soul a little bit in different places in Mongolia and South America, and I took my banjo to India. And so I don't know how it comes out, but I don't think about that very much. But I think that the traditional music that I've heard that really impressed me, are the things that echo in the way I play music anyway. Well, Hitting the Trail Tonight is one that I took Bruce Cascadden words and put the music to. Yeah. The moon rides high in the cloudless sky, stars are shining bright. The dark pines show on the hills below, the mountains capped with white. My spurs they ring and the song I sing, set to my horse's stride. We gallop along to an old-time song, it's out on the trail we ride. I'm hitting the trail tonight, I'm hitting the trail tonight. My horse is pulling the bridle reins, I'm hitting the trail tonight. could hear the sound as it strikes the ground on the frozen trail below. His hoofbeats hit and he fights the bit, he's slinging his head to go. I'll ride the trail till the stars turn pale, camp at the break of dawn. Nobody will know which way I go, they only know I've gone. I'm hitting the trail tonight, I'm hitting the trail tonight. My horse is pulling the bridle reins, I'm hitting the trail tonight. I did not try to say goodbye, let somebody else do that. I'll ride alone and I'll find a home wherever I hang my hat. Let people that sit and talk explain just whether I'm wrong or right. My horse is pulling the bridle reins, I'm hitting the trail tonight. The moon shines down on the rolling plains, tops of the mountains white. My horse is pulling the bridle reins, hitting the trail tonight. I'm hitting the trail tonight, I'm hitting the trail tonight. Horse is pulling the bridle reins, I'm hitting the trail tonight.
Great. I love that song.
It's good. I like that. Oh, the words are such a delight to sing. You know, Cascadin just, when you sing those words, they feel good in your mouth. And that's a nice thing. You know, they're just, they just roll off and they feel good in your mouth. I think that's good poetry does that.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I would like to thank Hal Cannon for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. You can find out more about his band Three Hat Trio at threehattrio.com. I'd also like to thank Baxendale Guitar for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about Baxendale at baxendaleguitar.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help support it, you could do me a big favor by leaving me a 5-star rating and writing a review in the iTunes store. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to Andy at andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.